Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Hey, welcome to this week's edition of Capital Dispatch. So, two main things that happened on the Hill this week I wanted to chat with you about. First off the top, of course, it was a budget pre-announcement bonanza. Again, this week we had Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Kristian Freeland, Housing Minister Sean Fraser, and others continuing to roll out pre-budget announcements, signaling what's going to be in next week's 2024 federal budget. As of now, in the totality of all the government has announced ahead of the budget, we're talking about $36.5 or so billion. About half of that is loans, half of that new spending money. So this has been going on for the last couple of weeks. Dispatch has been on hiatus because the House has been out. But while that's been happening, the government has tried this new strategy of trying to tease out various pieces of the budget in advance, rolling out essentially what we're expecting to be a good majority of what's going to be in it next Tuesday ahead of time. Just wanted to walk you through what exactly was announced this week. Started out on Monday with that much anticipated defense policy review. We're talking about around $8.1 billion over the next 5 years. Tuesday, we had that $500 million mental health fund for youth. Wednesday was $166.2 million for emergency response related to First Nations, as well as some mechanisms changing about volunteer firefighter tax refunds. And then Thursday was a series of mortgage rule tinkering, largely aimed at first-time homebuyers. And Friday, about any time now, we're expecting to hear a full housing policy update from Sean Fraser, kind of tying in all the various measures. So that is the big picture of what has been announced this week. But what I think really is important to keep in mind heading into next week are a couple things that Freeland said during the press conferences about these pre-budget announcements. We've been asking repeatedly if this is going to mean new taxes, because how are they going to fund this if they've promised to remain fiscally prudent and keep that deficit down? And while the government has affirmed that there's not going to be an increase or change for middle-class Canadians and their taxes, the government has consistently kind of danced around questions about whether there would be a wealth tax of some sort, a gains tax for people like high-income earners or grocery companies in this country. And we asked Freeland this week, and again, she kind of dodged this. So watch for that in the budget. I'm wondering if there's going to be some sort of higher income new tax to try to help bring in revenue for the government to finance this. Also, Freeland was asked if the deficit is going to is tied to this fiscal prudence commitment, is keeping the debt to deficit GDP ratio under control. And she said, no, the deficit's not going to rise. So those will be two things I'm watching heading into next week. Get into that a bit more when the budget comes. But all of this new money, they insist, is not going to be inflationary. Remains to be seen exactly how they're going to account for it. Also, just of note, because we have been covering the carbon tax in and outs through Capital Dispatch for a while now, this week the House of Commons dealt with another Conservative opposition motion about the carbon tax. This one was Pierre Poilievre calling the Prime Minister to meet with all of Canada's premiers to talk about this pollution pricing program. And it was a bit of an interesting twist this week because we saw both the Bloc and the NDP support this motion. Now, it's non-binding, doesn't tie the government's hands in any way, but just interesting to note that on the specific request around the carbon tax, when it comes to consulting with premiers, all opposition parties want the Prime Minister to do something. So far, the Liberals' answer on this has been, when we rolled out this federal backstop, we did meet with premiers. Important context or nuance here. Should take a look and see how many of the premiers that the Prime Minister met with back then, I think it was 2016, are still the premiers of those provinces today. So some arguments there about maybe it's time for a refresh. And so that is kind of the two main points, but depending on when you're catching this, MPs are currently locked in a filibuster of marathon voting in the House of Commons. This is around a sustainable jobs bill. It went late into the night last night. Took a break overnight into Friday morning. Those votes are continuing. The Conservatives have put up hundreds of amendments that the Liberals have suggested they used AI to help them with, trying to make a number of changes to this piece of legislation that is talking about what has become this kind of controversial issue of a just transition. So I'm watching that as well. You can follow me on Twitter at Rachel Aiello if you want to follow the latest about where that marathon voting session lands before the weekend.
Democracy requires constant vigilance and constant hard work. Didn't happen by accident, doesn't continue without effort. It's not just effort of commissioners and politicians and spooks. It's efforts of every single individual to feel like they have the full ability to engage in our democratic processes and to feel that they are safe and protected as they engage.
So that was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during his testimony before the public inquiry into foreign election interference in Canada. That was the other big thing this week, and this is why it is my quote of the week. During this testimony, all of these hearings have been going on, kind of culminating on Wednesday with the Prime Minister asking or answering questions about what he knew and when. And some of the big takeaways this week were questions around a briefing note prepared for CSIS, whether the government was aware of that or not, whether the Prime Minister read it, other little bits of new revelations around what the Prime Minister and his officials were told during the election when he was Liberal Party leader about some of the allegations around busing in of voters for a nomination race for who would then become Liberal MP Han Dong. And the Prime Minister was also speaking in his overall testimony about all the things, and we've heard this before if you've covered or followed any of the foreign interference coverage, all of the things the government has done to try to shore things up and seeming still to insist that that is enough. Obviously, the overall banner remains the integrity of these elections held. But why specifically this quote in this section of the Prime Minister's testimony was because this was his last answer, part of it, to the final question from Commission Counsel, kind of the lawyers leading this commission questioning him before he was cross-examined. And this was, I think, the closest we got to the version of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau who testified during the Emergencies Act inquiry. During that, we had a lot of more candid revelations, some interesting humility, I guess you could say, from the Prime Minister. And this answer was the closest we got to that more, I guess, philosophical version of things. So he's talking in here about how democracy needs to be protected. And he salutes now, even more than in years past, those who are stepping up to put their names in because of how the current state of political discourse is to run and how people are still, despite of how things are looking, wanting to serve their countries. And I just thought it was an interesting, more broad reflection to give you a bigger sense of where his head was at during this testimony, as opposed to some of the more nuanced in and out of the various allegations around what happened in 2019 and 2021. Okay, so what am I watching next week? Well, obviously Tuesday is budget day. So I will be watching, as I noted off the top, to see how the government is going to be financing all of these new promises, where the deficit stands, and if there is any shiny new penny announcement that the government is holding on to, wanting to reveal on budget day. But there is something else happening in the House next week that I also think is definitely worth flagging. On Wednesday, MPs are going to be making some history, taking this extremely rare, unprecedented step of summoning and sanctioning one of the GC Strategy's consultants. This is all tied up into that ArriveCan controversy that we've been following. Essentially, MPs agreed this week that this specific individual failed to provide the adequate responses when he was questioned before MPs at committee about the ArriveCan controversy and GC Strategy's role. So the House has decided that he has been found in contempt of Parliament. He is supposed to come to the bar of the House of Commons, so stand there before MPs and receive this admonishment. And then he is being asked to actually come forward with the answers that he's failed to provide. So this is quite a rare thing. You may remember this happened a couple years ago. The then head of the Public Health Agency of Canada in relation to failing to turn over documents related to the Winnipeg Labs affair. So it has happened semi-recently, but before that, we're talking decades and decades and decades since this kind of procedural power has been enacted. So I'll be watching that to see how that plays out, what answers are provided, And then from there, the government or MPs in the House have decided that they will assess his answer and consider next steps. So we'll see what comes from that and where this whole ArriveCan controversy goes from there.